Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and recently I posted a video where I looked at a video that was published by Martin Cothran of Memoria Press because I wanted to show parents that there is a fake classical education movement, and I've been explaining this for almost 14 years now, but I've never done so with any videos. But I wanted to show parents that there is what I call the fake classical education movement. And in order to show that, what I did was I explained the characteristics of this fake classical education movement. And then I went through a few videos where I showed those characteristics again and again through those videos. The second video that I looked at was by Martin Cothran, titled "What is Classical Education?", which should be an obvious source for understanding what these folks believe classical education to be. And we went through that video, and I pointed out all of the different red flags, as I called them, as we went through it. And Mr. Cothran wrote a response to that video, and I responded to it since, and we went back and forth a few times. And to be honest, I felt like it was a lot of distracting gibberish that Mr. Cothran was writing in response to my criticism, because my criticism in his video was very straightforward. I showed what he said, and I explained that it's not true, and then he responded and went into a number of bizarre different arguments. But I kept focused on one specific issue, and the one specific issue that I'm concerned with, because one thing about people who are conference speakers and book writers is they can just flood videos and discussions with all kinds of distracting information that really has nothing to do with the principal issue. And here's the principal issue. There are people, this has been my accusation all along, there are people who since the 1990s have set themselves up as advisors to private schools and homeschools. And they have promoted something called classical education, which has nothing to do with the history of education. It's a modern idea. It's based on Protestant ideas about education. That's why it comes from Dorothy Sayers, who was a Protestant novelist who spoke about education. And as Doug Wilson pointed out in a video I did, he explains from John Comenius in the 1500s, a Protestant reformer. And that educational idea, which was developed and promoted by Protestants through history and also in the 1990s, was simply absorbed or taken by Catholics who got into the publishing business and homeschool business, even private school business, and simply rebranded these Protestant ideas as Catholic, putting pictures of saints and the Virgin Mary on their resources, and selling them to Catholic families, telling them that this is the education that saints enjoyed in history, when in fact it was a Protestant idea about education. So I've talked about this fake education movement, and one of the publishers that's been at the center of this movement is Memoria Press, and Mr. Cothran has been involved as a speaker and as an author for Memoria Press through the years. But my argument is these men and women who have driven this fake classical education movement are talking about subjects. I mean, they talk confidently about subjects and advise parents on subjects that they know nothing about. And when I say that, and let me say it again, these people in this fake classical education movement have not studied these subjects, and they advise Christian parents on subjects that they have never studied themselves. And when I say that, I can understand why some people might get upset. They might think that I'm just judging people or making accusations that I can't prove, but I can prove them. And I've explained in these videos where they sort of give it away that they haven't actually studied these subjects. I've pointed out that again and again in a number of videos, 4 or 5 videos now, hours and hours of commentary I've provided. But some may still think that, I'm just being mean, I'm just picking on people and so on, when that's not what I'm doing. I'm telling Christian parents, I'm telling Christian homeschool parents that these people who are giving advice on homeschooling and classical education have not studied the subjects that they're talking about and advising people on. And that's what concerns me. I don't care if someone wants to create their own school program. You can sell anything you want in the name of education. That's fine. It's up to parents ultimately to decide what they're going to teach their children. I don't care if people come up with all kinds of ideas about education and they've got their own theories and philosophy. That's fine. That's for parents to choose from, and it's fine. But when I see people talking to Christian parents, pretending to know things that they don't actually know, and advising them and telling them what to think and what to do in the education of their children, that makes me upset. Because I know that those parents are trusting that this nice woman or this friendly man is not going to mislead them, when in fact they are misleading them. And I want to show parents that. And I've said this again and again, not because I want to embarrass these people or anything like that. It has to be done for the sake of the truth. My desire in the long term is for a restoration of real classical Catholic education to be enjoyed by Catholic families. One of my frustrations in that work is that this fake classical education movement has created so much confusion that it's actually in the way of the progress of real classical Catholic education. And that's why I want parents to see this so they can set this out of the way and start learning about the real thing and actually provide that education, the education of saints, to their children. Now, after I posted my video criticizing Mr. Cothran's definition of classical education in his video, he wrote a response, and as I said, we went back and forth a little, but finally I just cut to the quick, and I said, listen, have you ever studied the 7 liberal arts? Yes or no? I want to show you what I actually wrote. I wrote to Mr. Cothran this message right here. Have you studied classical grammar? And I named the authors that throughout history have been considered the masters on classical grammar. Have you studied the 6 works of Aristotle's Organon? That's the master text on classical logic. Have you studied the rhetorical treatises of Aristotle and Cicero? Those are the authoritative sources on the art of rhetoric. Have you studied Nicomachus on arithmetic? Have you studied Euclid on geometry? Have you studied Boethius's work from the Middle Ages on music? Have you studied Ptolemy's Almagest, which is the classic text on classical astronomy? So I simply asked Mr. Cothran, yes or no, have you actually studied the 7 liberal arts? Are you familiar with the writings of the masters of the 7 liberal arts? I wrote, these works contain the 7 classical liberal arts, which have been taught for centuries of Christian history. Have you studied these works? A simple yes or no would suffice. This is a very simple, objective question. And if you have never studied these works, because I made the assumption that he hasn't studied these works based on things he writes and says. If you have never studied these works, how have you spoken of the 7 liberal arts as a teacher and advisor for all these years? I think that's a very fair question, and I asked him directly. I'm accusing him of not studying the 7 liberal arts. Some people might think that's not fair. He reacted to my video and said, said that what I said is not true. I just asked him directly, have you studied the 7 classical liberal arts? Okay? Because you have spoken of the 7 liberal arts as a teacher and advisor. You're advising people on the 7 liberal arts. You're giving homeschool families advice and telling them what they can do and should do about these subjects. And I don't believe that you've studied these subjects. So tell me, have you studied these subjects? Now, what I'd like to show you here is a short video. I'm not going to show you the video. I'm going to show you one part of the video because I'm going to give you an example of where, and this was from 2015. This is what, 7 years ago? Mr. Cothran has been advising homeschool families on the 7 liberal arts. And I want you to see this. He explicitly names them and gives families advice on what to do in teaching these liberal arts. So just listen to this with me and you'll see this is a video, a webinar, I think, of him advising homeschool parents on how to teach the classical curriculum with the 7 liberal arts. So just listen.
The first one was, how does a concern with the great books and the liberal arts work out in the school curriculum? So basically the answer to that question is through the liberal arts, these generalizable intellectual skills, the 3 linguistic skills of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the 4 mathematical skills of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And as I said yesterday, if it makes you feel better, you can replace astronomy and music with algebra and calculus.
Okay, so we see here explicitly, I'm not making this up, he is telling homeschool parents what the 7 liberal arts are, which is fine, right? We would assume that he knows what he's talking about, but do you notice what he does at the end? He says, you can simply replace music and astronomy with algebra and calculus. He's advising parents that they can simply switch out 2 of the 7 liberal arts and replace them with modern mathematics. Now, how can he advise parents and tell them that this is so if he has never studied these arts? He doesn't even know what the subject material of the classical mathematical arts is. And how do I know that? Because he said so. I'll show you. When I asked him, have you studied these works? Have you studied the 7 liberal arts? He responded with this long-winded response and didn't answer the question. He didn't answer the question. I posted this discussion on the website. You can look it up if you'd like to read what he wrote. But he didn't answer my very simple question. Have you studied these works? Yes or no? A simple yes or no would suffice. This is a very simple, objective question. Yes or no? Have you studied these works? And what we got in response was this long-winded answer that didn't address the question. Okay? So finally, I replied to his response and I said, I'll take that as a no. You have not actually studied the classical liberal arts. And he replied and wrote, I've read most of Aristotle's Organon, all of his rhetoric, a number of Cicero's dialogues, some of Euclid and Boethius, but not his book on music. So there's Mr. Cothran's answer to my question. Have you studied the 7 liberal arts? Notice he made no mention of classical grammar, so we'll take that as a no. He said he's read most of Aristotle's Organon, so we'll give him logic, okay? I don't know what most of it means, but we'll say he has studied the Organon, which is the source text for logic. He has studied Aristotle's rhetoric, so that's good. He then says a number of Cicero's dialogues, which is irrelevant because that's not what I asked about. I asked if he studied Cicero's rhetorical treatises, his actual works on the art of rhetoric. So we'll take that as a no. So he studied Aristotle's logic and Aristotle's rhetoric. He has not studied Cicero's rhetoric and doesn't seem to have studied classical grammar. He says he has studied some of Euclid. Well, Euclid is the source of classical geometry. So some geometry, no classical arithmetic, no classical music, and no classical astronomy. So he has studied some or most of Aristotle's Organon, logic, Aristotle's rhetoric, and some classical geometry. He studied some of 3 of the 7 liberal arts. He has not studied classical arithmetic, music, or geometry, 3 of the 4 mathematical classical liberal arts, and only some of geometry. And again, I don't know how much, what he means by some or most. But the answer to the question is no. Mr. Cothran has not studied the 7 liberal arts, and yet he's advising homeschool parents on how to teach these things to their children. Let's just go back and look at this again. Let's go back to, it was the 317 mark here. This is a man who admits he never studied the classical mathematical arts. But watch as he advises parents on how to study and how they can change this and move this around. This is the advice that parents have been receiving in this fake classical education movement.
This webinar, the first one was, how does a concern with the great books and the liberal arts work out in the school curriculum? So basically the answer to that question is through the liberal arts, these generalizable intellectual skills, the 3 linguistic skills of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the 4 mathematical skills of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And as I said yesterday, if it makes you feel better, you can replace astronomy and music with algebra and calculus.
So we've got homeschool parents being advised on how they can do things in mathematics within this idea of classical education from a man who isn't telling these parents that he's never actually studied these subjects. All right? This is what I'm talking about. So if you want to treat me like I'm some kind of, some cruel troublemaker because I'm pointing out the truth about these things, you can do that. And you can take this advice that you can just switch out subjects and replace classical studies with modern studies. You can do that if you want to, but you're taking advice from a person who never studied classical music or classical arithmetic, studied some of classical geometry and none of classical astronomy. So you can take that advice, but I'm warning you that this is not good advice you're getting. You're not getting advice from experts. And to be fair, I will say that Mr. Cothran is probably one of the better sources on classical education. He probably is. Compared to the other people, he probably is the most expert of those people. That's how bad the movement is. The people advising homeschool parents, they haven't even studied these subjects. Mr. Cothran admits he hasn't studied these 7 subjects, which I already told, I explained to parents that I can tell by his videos and things he writes that he hasn't studied the classical subjects. But this is the fake classical education movement, and homeschool parents from places like Memoria Press, Mother of Divine Grace School, and others have been getting this ignorant advice on homeschooling for 20 years as this movement has just promoted itself with all confidence and assurance that they know what they're talking about, and they're restoring this old form of education and recovering the lost tools of learning. They're giving advice to people about subjects that they have not studied. And someone's got to call these folks out. And, I'm appreciative of the fact that when I asked Mr. Cothran, he finally did admit that he hasn't studied the 7 liberal arts. Because in order for us to move forward, I don't care about this reality. I don't care that this fake classical education movement has caused all this confusion in the past and has misinformed so many Catholic families and has really hindered the progress of Catholic education. All that I care about is that we get on the right track and we actually move forward to restore classical Catholic education. I don't care about errors or mistakes or misleading advice that's been given. I really don't care. I'm not trying to attack these people. I don't see them as competitors in any way. I see them as a source of confusion that's hindering the restoration of real classical Catholic education, which is my only concern. I want to see that restored, and I don't want homeschool parents being confused and led down these dead-end roads by advisors who honestly don't know what they're talking about. My concern is getting these confusing sources of fake classical education out of the way so we can all start talking about real classical education and actually study the 7 liberal arts and actually give our kids the real thing. That's my only concern. So I just wanted to follow up because Mr. Cothran followed up, and I appreciate the fact that he admitted not studying the 7 liberal arts, but at the same time, the verbose, long responses that pull things out of context, that ignore my actual claims in the videos, they're just more distractions. They're just more distractions. The issue is very simple and very clear. If you claim to be an expert on classical education, and from your own mouth, you tell parents that classical education consists of the study of the 7 liberal arts and the great books, which I disagree with. But if you're telling people about the 7 liberal arts and then presenting yourself, as we see here, as an advisor on curriculum decisions and what subjects can be studied and how these can be switched out or replaced, if you're presenting yourself as an advisor and you haven't studied these 7 liberal arts, this game has to stop. We can't do this as Christian people. We can't misinform and falsely advise fellow Christians about subjects that we haven't studied. That's my concern. My concern is that this fake classical education movement, these publishers who have just been selling things, without knowledge of the subjects that they're teaching and speaking on, because they've had this captive audience of Christian parents who have not received a classical education, only understand modern ideas about education, and are trusting people who step up and claim to know these things to give them good advice. They're not getting good advice. That's what upsets me. So I appreciate the fact that we've got clarity on this. I'm happy that my assumptions were not false. They were true. And what I'm hoping now is, having seen this, that Catholic parents can move forward and start learning what the real classical Catholic curriculum is, and actually give their kids the opportunity to study the same subjects that were studied and taught by saints and wise men all through history. So I hope that's helpful. I don't mean to be combative in these things, because this is a very simple matter of truth and error. It's simply black and white. Like I said, these other publishers, they're not my competitors. There's no competition for the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, because we're the only place that's even claiming to actually restore a historical classical education from the original sources. These other programs aren't even pretending to do that. Although they claim to be restoring classical education, they don't even pretend to teach the real sources of that education. They haven't even studied the real sources of that education. So I hope that this allows us to move forward to the next level of understanding real classical Catholic education. If you want to know, where should you look next for some positive instruction in this stuff, on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website, there's a free book titled Understanding Classical Catholic Education. You can download a copy of that and read away. It's set out by topics, and you can go through that and start to learn the history and the principles of real classical Catholic education. If you have any questions, send them along. I'll help you find the answers. I've been at this for 25 years now. I've been teaching in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy for almost 15 years now. We've got the curriculum restored, and now we're working on making it accessible to students and improving our ability to teach it and assess student work, so that we can really start to develop mastery in real classical Catholic education. So I hope that's helpful, and if you've got any questions, just please let me know. God bless you all.